Obviously, huge congratulations to everyone for making it to the elimination rounds. Let's get started. We are proud to affirm today's resolution that the United States federal government should set term limits on representatives serving the United States House of Representatives. Framework, first of all, this is a policy round. I think that's pretty clearly indicated by the word should in the resolution. It means we will propose a government action, they will negate that government action. We believe that this should be weighed on a basic framework of net benefits, which is the utility that we've all been talking about. Greatest good to the greatest number of people, we all know what that means, the plan. The United States federal government should limit representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives to 6 2-year terms. The United States federal government should limit representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives to 6 2-year terms. Questions?
Sounds good.
Okay. Solvency, we can do this. The Supreme Court has previously ruled that at a federal level we have the right to regulate the number of terms that people serve in both houses of Congress. We just haven't decided to do it yet. Advantage one is incumbency. Look to what's happening right now. First, incumbents have a substantial advantage in being able to win the races that they're involved in. First of all, MIT Economics did a study that found that over 80% of people in general are re-elected in the House of Representatives. And the reason for this is because when you are already serving the House of Representatives, you have access to things like institutional funding. You have access to things like funding from your party, funding from Democratic and Republican congressional campaign committees, all of which create institutional pressures that make it much easier to win an election if you are the incumbent in that election, as opposed to if you are a challenger or if you're a new runner in either the party that previously held the seat or the party that is trying to take over the seat. Furthermore, Politico specifically found in 2012 that the ratio was 90%, as in 90% of the people currently serving the House were able to win their seat back and not lose to a challenger. This indicates that there is a substantial advantage for those already serving the House being able to keep the seat that they currently hold in the House and not losing them to other people. Another reason this is the case is specifically because of the influence of lobbyists. We would argue that when you've been in power for a number of years, you have the ability to develop relationships with business interests, corporate interests, etc., all of which will tend to fund your re-election campaigns if you serve their interests, which means you have access to just more sources of funding and more amounts of funding than you previously do. This is critical because funding is empirically highly correlated with the rate at which someone wins an election. In fact, over 95% of the time, the person who has more funding in an election tends to win. This means that incumbents who tend to have more sources of funding, more sources of institutional support at a local and national level, inevitably tend to win their election. The second argument is that this results in people who serve in Congress for not 10 years or 20 years, but sometimes far longer than that. We would cite John Dingell, who is a member of the House of Representatives, who's been serving for 30 terms or 60 years, i.e. he got there in 1955, which is only one egregious example of the general trend. Furthermore, this means that the more you are in power and the longer you are in power, the more the amount of money that you're able to leverage and the amount of influence that you're able to leverage to hold your seat only grows. The incumbency advantage never goes down, it never reduces, it just continues increasing. So the more time you spend in the House, the more able you are to stay in the House and not lose to a challenger. The links? First of all is just the plan passes. As a result of the plan passing, this means we limit people from being able to stay in the House for very long and thus limit the impact of the incumbency advantage. The internal links? First, this means that there's a limit to how much clout people can build up, because while 12 years is a comparatively long time, it is not 60 years. And so if there is a limit to how long you can serve in the House of Representatives, that's also a limit to how much effective influence you can develop, how many different people you can be calling on in your re-election campaigns to say, okay, I need you to fund this campaign, I need you to fund me remaining in office. Furthermore, it means that where you might be able to stay in Congress for 20 or 30 years, no matter how good your influence network is, no matter how many contacts you can leverage and how many corporations you develop relationships with, you are still only serving the House for 12 years. Second, the plan also encourages people to focus on the medium term and not the long term of their own political interests. Argument is that in a world where people are focusing mainly on their own political interests, they inevitably are focusing on trying to have a 3 or 4 decade long career. That inevitably makes it difficult for them to focus on the interest of their constituents, because while particular constituents' preferences might go away or change in a few years, they know that the corporations that are funding them to adopt particular positions and the political structures encouraging them to ignore what their constituents say are still going to be there in 2 decades. So if people are focusing only on trying to have 3-decade careers, that means they're ignoring the interests of the constituents in the short term. It means that inevitably it's critical to have people who are going to respond to short-term voter feedback, who are going to respond to what people are saying right now and implement that into policy, which means we need term limits because it encourages people to think about their careers in terms of a limited amount of time and not just an infinite period of time during which they can serve on Capitol Hill and never lose. Third, this also resets districts. Argument is that there are individual districts currently that are populated by highly popular candidates, for instance, a Republican in a highly Democratic district, which makes those districts unrepresentative of the voters in those districts. It's critical for those districts to occasionally reset and for the highly popular incumbent to be unable to run again, because that way it keeps the House of Representatives in line with popular opinion and in line with the actual preferences of the voters in those districts. The impact is democracy, which is critical for a couple of reasons. First, democracy at the local level is critical to solve for the environment. We would cite the fact that specific instances of environmental devastation, things like placing a Superfund site or a toxic waste disposal site in an area that should be placed in, or using inadequate safety on nuclear plants, etc. All these things occur at a local level, which means that responsiveness of representatives in the House to their constituents in individual small areas is critical to check for environmental devastation occurring at a small scale and at a large scale collectively, which means it's critical to solve for tens of thousands of deaths due to things like cancer, etc., that tend to result from environmental devastation, tend to result from uncontrolled disposal of toxic waste, things like that. But second, it's also critical to local responsiveness in a broader way, because when people value their constituents over leadership, they're more likely to be willing to push measures that are critical to what the voters in that district want, things like economic revitalization, etc., which inevitably means that it pushes tens of thousands of people out of poverty, reduces dehumanization, improves their quality of life. Yes?
Could you just repeat the word on the last impact?
Last impact, the argument is that it's just that people are more willing to push things that they would normally stay away from because they're toxic at the leadership level. So if the Republican Party doesn't like some relief measure, but your district needs it, you're more likely to push it. Advantage 2 is gridlock. The uniqueness is that currently representatives have an incentive not to work with people from the other party because that inevitably makes them unpopular with the people within their own party. We would cite the fact that most Republican constituents, even when the interest of their constituents, most Republican representatives, even with the interest of their constituents, line up with the Democrats, are unwilling to vote with the Democrats because inevitably their political futures are tied to being able to make people like Paul Ryan, people like Reince Priebus like them in the future, which means that if people are always thinking about having 20 or 30-year-long careers, they're unable to respond to the incentives that would normally make them collaborate with people across the aisle. This inevitably means that it leads to a breakdown in the functioning of government, things like budget shortfalls, shutdowns of the government, inability to fund basic services, which inevitably means that a world of more gridlock is a world of less functional government. The link obviously is that the plan solves this because in a world where people are more able to respond to those incentives that, to work across the aisle, less responsive to the incentives of leadership, who are saying, if you want a 30-year career here, you better make me happy. That inevitably means that there's more cooperation. Links to a couple of impacts. First, government shutdowns and disruptions to services inevitably lead to poverty and shocks because a number of people who rely on those services to stay above the poverty line inevitably would be driven under the poverty line. It means tens of thousands of people suffer things like hunger, etc. as a result of being driven under the poverty line. It means that access to government services and access to consistent government funding is critical to solve for those people being kept above the poverty line, reducing dehumanization, quality of life, etc.
So, the order's going to be 2 off, half in order. Any questions? Anybody not ready?
Go ahead.
Okay, time starts now. First is the representative effectiveness DA. A is the inherency. 1, there's no term limit in the SQUO. 2, California passed a measure called Prop 28, which is basically a limit on the representative length in the California state legislature. No one liked this. It was terrible. Everybody hated it. 3, politicians think long-term right now in the status quo because they actually have to get elected long-term and therefore have to pass long-term policies in order to get elected and could benefit the constituents over the long term. 4, good institutional memory is inherent right now because there's lots of people that have been staying in Congress for a long time that actually developed a lot of knowledge about how Congress runs and what the policies are being debated. 5, let's see. Okay, yeah, Pete, question? Yes?
Why is it critical, as a member of the House of Representatives, that instead of being responsive to my constituents, I am highly versed on parliamentary procedure and I know exactly when to call to motion?
I don't say it's parliamentary procedure, I say you're well versed on the issues. Like, I'm going to get to it on the impacts level. Okay, so right now, Congress, people can have long-term limits, meaning they don't need to look to outside sources to actually provide for employment after they get out of Congress. Okay, link, plan passes, people rotate out a lot more. C is the internal links. So, 1, there's no institutional memory, meaning that Congress is going to have to actually rely on lobbyists who are actually there for a long time. Lobbyists stay in this circuit for like 50 years, meaning that they're the actual ones that know about the policies. When a congressman needs to learn about the policy, they basically have to turn to the lobbyists. Get to the impact level down there. 2 is corruption. People know they'll be out of a job really soon because of the term limits, right? If they know they're going to be out of a job, in 2 years, they're going to actually pander to corporations and pander to lobbyists. If they know that they're going to be out of a job, they will actually create policies that are in the interest of these corporations so they can get hired as lobbyists. That leads to corruption. 3, they don't actually have to engage in long-term thinking because they're going to be out of office really soon. They just have to engage in short-term thinking. They provide short-term benefits to their constituencies, meaning they get elected in the short term. Okay, D is the impacts. 1, serial policy failure. If people are thinking in the short term, not in the long term, it's super bad for everybody because they just provide like massive stimulus in the short term that screws everybody over in the long term. Serial policy failure throughout the entire Congress. That probably turns a lot of affirm impacts. 2, massive corruption, basically they basically pander to corporations making jobs as lobbyists. And they also have no institutional knowledge. They have to actually turn to lobbyists to actually fill them in on the issues, because they don't actually have knowledge or any prep. They've been in there for 2 years or something. Basically means corruption, few impacts.
You do realize we are limiting them to amount of time longer than the current average term?
Yeah, okay, I still say there's a bunch of people that have been in Congress for 50 or 60 years that can leave the party, right? It's an institutional memory thing. It's not a problem if there's only a few people, it's a problem if there's everybody.
Most tenured congressmen are the heads of subcommittees that are really important.
Yeah, most long-term congressmen are the heads of subcommittees and are the one actually making influential decisions. So basically, you reintroduce the cycle of poverty because these people aren't actually responsible to their constituents, they're responsible to corporations because those are the people that are upholding their interests. Also, they were more responsible to people like oil lobbyists who are promoting global warming. Next, solvency, stock issues. Yay, solvency is a stock issue. If they don't win solvency, they don't win the debate. Okay, in 1995, the Supreme Court ruled that term limits were unconstitutional. This was, oh god, what's my writing here? This was the U.S. It was
U.S. term limits.
Yeah, U.S. term limits versus Thornton. Basically, based on the 17th Amendment, ruled that the right resting the people to actually pick representatives for Congress. That's the specific text of the 17th Amendment. Supreme Court ruled that means you cannot regulate term limits. No, not right now. So that basically means they can't pass this plan through Congress. So the Supreme Court has already ruled it's unconstitutional. The only way they can do it is through the state legislature. The only way they can actually pass a constitutional amendment, the only way to pass the plan is through the states. The only actor in the resolution is the USFG. They don't have fiat power over state legislatures, meaning they can't actually pass this. We say state legislatures probably won't pass the plan because it actually decreases the amount of time their head representatives can actually stay in Congress. Okay, that's a complete solvency takeout to the F. Go to the framework. There's a serious plan flaw here. They specify they limit terms to 6 two-year terms. That basically means all senior members of Congress go away immediately as soon as the plan is passed. That's an immediate link into institutional memory. You lose a whole bunch of really senior congressmen, and basically, that's also a takeout to the app, because you lose all these constituent members, right? They can no longer communicate with their constituencies, because they've exceeded the 6-year term limit, or the 12-year term limit, and they're gone as soon as the plan passes. That means you have more environmental harms in environmental harms in these areas that they're talking about. Not right now. You have more environmental harms they're talking about because people can't actually communicate with these elected congressmen because they're not there because they just got kicked out as soon as the plan passed. Pretty much links into all their DAs about all their advantages about local stuff. So go on to the incumbents advantage. A few responses here. Their key internal link is basically money. My response here is a study done by Professor Stephen Levitt from Yale. He basically says that they have the causality all wrong. We say that money doesn't actually cause elections to swing. It's popularity. People who are representatives who are actually popular get more money, and they win the elections because they're more popular. It's not causality. Causality goes completely the other way. He did a study where he looked at specifically congressional districts where people ran against each other more than one time, and basically determined the causality went this direction. That means money doesn't actually do anything in elections and doesn't swing them. That's a key internal link out for the entirety of this first contention.
Question?
Yeah, sure.
So you say that in your disadvantage, you make the same argument that people are going to seek out money because they think that they need that. And so, wait, hold on. You have an argument premised on the idea of corruption. Why would I bother to engage in corruption if having money apparently doesn't help me win elections?
Having money for elections doesn't help you. You want personal money and personal riches, right?
No.
People who donate to your campaign, that doesn't go into your personal coffers for you to distribute wherever you want. Okay. Next, they talk about how more time and more influence builds all this stuff, and we say it doesn't build connections, right? Because you become less dependent on lobbyists, and you can make your own decisions. Doesn't actually build influence because you become more independent of these people. They don't really want to fund you anymore because you have your own ideas. Let's see. Then they say specifically that people can't focus on their constituents and they're going to focus on corporations. But we specifically turn this and tell you that people will engage in long-term thinking because they actually have incentive to be elected long-term. That means that also, preferences for the voters stay the same over the long term, right? Gay marriage has been a super big issue for the Republicans for a long time. Same thing for the Democrats for things like I don't know, welfare funding or whatever. Basically, corporations, if money doesn't matter, that takes that out. Okay, move on to the second DA. So, I say grandfather basically turns this, right? If the grandfather goes away and most of the representatives go away, you lose a whole bunch of government function. Also, like, people who are directly responsive to their constituents are going to be gridlocked right now. Like, look at the Tea Party, look at Bernie Sanders supporters. These are people that are super radical and don't compromise. If you listen to your constituents right now, it's gridlock. For all those reasons, I strongly urge a negative vote.
I'm gonna go aft case to neg case. Anyone not ready?
1 second. Cool.
Alright, judges. Time begins now. We once again strongly affirm today's resolution. First off, I'm going to touch on the part of our plan where they talk about how all of the current members of Congress who have been in Congress for more than this 12 years would immediately go away. First of all, this is not in any way within normal means of what a plan would do. This is unprecedented. These plans simply do not occur. People don't just leave the House in the middle of a term, and there's absolutely no infrastructure or enforcement in place to allow this to happen. Second of all, the warrant for this, we can look at the fact that when presidential term limits were passed, it took effect after the next election. So when the people were kicked out, not allowed to serve longer, it wasn't in the middle of the election, it's after the next one. So we find that there's absolutely no reason that they'd be kicked out immediately, but at the next election, if they've already served 6 terms, they would not be allowed to run again. There's absolutely no reason they'd go out in the middle of the term, so this entire argument falls. On to our first point about incumbency. The first response they make is that this causality is wrong and that money doesn't sway elections whatsoever, and there's just popularity. First of all, this ignores the very clear statistics that 95% of the time it is the better funded candidate who wins. Regardless of popularity, money is coming first. Additionally, most of this popularity does come from having the additional funding capable to be seen broadly. We find that many voters only vote based on who they know. When they have more money, you can run more TV ads, you're more visible to the wider public. That is what causes this type of popularity and makes it significantly easier for people to be well known, which is why they're more likely to win. We find that the money specifically helps these incumbents who are already to some extent known, and the money helps them continue to win over and over again.
Separate from money, incumbency also occurs because of institutional factors.
Incumbency also helps because of these institutional factors. It's a lot easier once you're already in the House, you already have the support of your political party, as well as specific campaigns within the House itself. Thus we find they have a substantial advantage, again 80%, and now recently increasing to a 90% advantage for the incumbent, which is an extremely large amount of these people who are being sent again and again and again because of lobbyists, because they have these advantages of being in the House already. They talk about how this doesn't depend on lobbyists, however it actually empirically does, because we find that they are more likely to have lobbyists who influence these representatives in the long term and want them to continue to support their policies. I'd specifically cite the example of a lot of Republican representatives who continue to follow the NRA to get their funding over and over again, despite the fact that their constituents and such do not necessarily support this, but this is how they get reelected over and over again because they're getting this lobbyist funding. They also said that turn they're going to be getting, they're not thinking towards the long term, or they should think towards the long term without these term limits. However, the long term is the corporations. The corporations are how they get the money to stay in power. It's not necessarily the people, because in many instances the representatives are not representing what their constituents actually want. We find that many of the very vital issues do change in the short term. They cited things such as gay marriage, but we find that the positions on that have shifted very significantly recently, as well as things like, for instance, a new plant being built next door that could cause extreme toxins or other environmental damages isn't a long-term issue. These are the type of short-term things that we need to have these representatives paying attention to in the status quo and right now. So we can look through and extend all the rest of our links and internal links and find that we're limiting the influence of all these people who are allowing themselves to get reelected over and over again, and that they're more likely to focus on these medium-term issues that are more important to their constituents, as well as that we're resetting these districts that have been for a very long time, for instance, that they're Democrat represented by a Republican or vice versa. And the impact still stands of allowing us to have more local democracy, which allows us to respond to things such as environmental change, as well as economic issues that are vital to the health and survival of these people. On to the second point about gridlock. The first argument they say is this thing about how if they're going away immediately, this will turn, but as I've already explained, explain this simply is not going to happen. And the argument that they're gridlocked right now, that we don't want them stuck in the way they are right now. The constituents aren't going to stay the exact same way as we find today. So by having more and more new people sent in, we're also likely to reduce the power of people like populists, of the different people such as Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, etc., because it's not seen as Washington being super entrenched. Because there's more turnover, we're less likely to get these really far out there and extremists who would be able to take over and make this significantly worse. So we see that our impacts still stand of being able to help prevent more of this government shutdown, which hurts especially the poor. It causes more hunger and dehumanization. On to the first negative point of effectiveness. That they need to be in the House longer to be effective. First of all, 12 years is already longer than many of these representatives stay in the House. As we said, it's more than 3 years longer than the average term, so we find that most of these people will have more experience than they have right now. We also find that the example they cite of California is significantly different with states because they don't necessarily have a term limit before the executive, and for other parts of the government, with a term limit on the executive as well as the legislative, it becomes more balanced. In addition, I've already said this whole long-term issue is looking towards corporations. We don't want them looking to the long term of corporations. We want them looking towards the medium term of their constituents and what their constituents actually want. As for the issue of institutional memory, we find that because the House of Representatives only re-elects they have these elections every 2 years and they're not all going to be sent out at the exact same time, we'll still have a significant number of representatives who know how things work and will be able to continue helping the House function anyway. So we see there's absolutely no reason that any of this would occur. We find that this reliance on lobbyists exists right now. This is entirely non-unique. People are already looking to lobbyists to know what they want to do on certain issues, so there's absolutely no reason this would happen. As for the issue of corruption, they're more likely to be corrupt when they know that they'll be protected from any sort of legal action because they're in the House of Representatives. If they know they're soon not going to be in office and could be actually tried for illegal actions, they're less likely to have these forms of corruption and less likely to do all these things, which means they're less likely to cause these negative detriments. Yes?
Could you just repeat the argument?
The argument is that they don't have this legal immunity once they leave the House, so they're less likely to do these bad things. On the issue of this serial policy failure, we found that this is not going to occur because they're actually going to be looking towards the constituents. If there's any risk that we're solving for the situation right now, which is clearly negative, we'll be able to vote for the affirmative team. We find that we have the lobby in all of these issues right now. We don't need these 50 to 60 year terms for people to know how to run committees. A lot of people are a lot newer than that, and that type of experience of 50 to 60 years becomes way too much.
Absolutely no stated impact to either institutional memory or serial
There's
policy
absolutely no impact to either of these things, serial policy failure or institutional memory. So if you compare to the affirmative team's points, we have the better impacts there. On their second point of solvency, first of all, this is not a stock issue framing, nor should it be. Net benefits is a better way to weigh them around. If we look at stock issues, if they take out our solvency, then you can say that the net benefit is zero, but we should be looking overall at the benefits and harms of a certain plan, not just these specific stock issues. As for the Supreme Court's case specifically, they ruled that states could not set term limits for their own senators or for their own representatives. It is allowed under this case for Congress to set its own limits, as well as by the fact that because the resolution has to be possible under parliamentary debate by durable fiat, it's the concept that it has to be able to happen. If a constitutional amendment is necessary, it will be passed. However, under the Supreme Court case, it is not necessary for the resolution to occur because they are allowed to set their own term limits. It's simply the states that cannot under the Supreme Court case. Thus, there's absolutely no reason that this plan cannot be passed, and it would be a good thing in the long term, and for these reasons, we strongly affirm.
So I put solvency on the plan sheet, so I'm going to be hitting that first. Then I'm going to be going, so it's solvency with all that stuff. Then I'm going to be going their case in order, which is incumbency, and then gridlock, and then representative effectiveness.
Where do you have the normal means debate or the whole forcing people out argument?
I have that in two places. I have it on the first sheet. I probably won't be hitting it there. Then I'll be hitting it on. I think I only
Come on,
have
what are you
one place.
doing?
I'll have it. I'll get it at the top with plan.
All right,
Okay?
that's good.
All right.
Oh, thank you.
On solvency. Time starts. Now they say look to the framing of net benefits only. That's not something you should be doing in today's round. The affirmative team has to prove that they do something in today's round, otherwise you're basically just leaving it as the status quo, which is the negative team. Okay, the negative is defending the status quo, so if they don't do anything, if they don't prove that they're actually solving anything or doing anything new in the, or that has any effect inside of the real world, you're going to be voting for the negative in today's debate. That net benefit framing doesn't really work. Then they say you have to look to do it or durable fiat and have the resolution actually has to be implemented possibly inside a parliamentary debate for things to for things to work, if we can show you that there's a way that like it actually can't even physically take place, like these, when they say durable fiat, it still has to go through like the United States federal government, right? They can't just say that it magically appears out of thin air, and if we prove that there exists no pathway for it to go through the United States federal government, they can't fiat that it suddenly appears over there. They have to go through they have to go through what currently exists, and what currently exists prohibits this from taking place over here.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You do realize that Congress can literally just pass a law that says we now have these term limits, we cannot stay in office any longer than this?
So the issue with that is like we give you analysis in our first speech that that's unconstitutional. So one, like because of historical precedent over there, which means that
Factual disagreement, look at that.
yeah, okay, like I mean we just disagree on these two facts. You can look it up. The thing was like U.S. term limits versus Thornton. That was the case if you want to look at that. But the argument here is that like you can't actually pass it, which means that they don't solve, which means that it doesn't pass, which means they don't get access to any of their solvency. So that takes out their solvency. So then here comes this thing where we say that all the senior congressmen leave immediately over here. They say that's not normal, means like they don't leave immediately, like in the middle of their term. Their second one, their second response here is kind of similar to that vein. Okay, they leave at the end of the 2 years or whenever their next term comes up. But the issue with this here is that a lot of the senior leaders that have been in the party for more than 12 years are the ones that are running the important committees inside of the Congress right now. For example, you have John Conyers, who is the House lead on the judiciary, who has been part of the United States federal government and part of the United States House of Representatives since like 1978. He's been here for a really long time, and if you lose him, you lose like more than 40 years of historical precedent in the United States on the board that's reviewing judiciary process in the United States. That's a bad thing. There are more than like 30 other committees or 40 committees right now that are just under the House of Representatives. They're all chaired by like really tenured members of the House of Congress. You lose all of the elite like people inside of Congress that are running the show right now, which means you have to be replaced by new candidates who haven't been previously exposed to politics, which means you have a lot of people that are like fresh out of high school with their political sciences degrees that are now running the United States federal government. That's a bad thing to do because these people don't know what they're like. They don't have any actual experience in the United States running things. It's better to keep the tenured politicians in and go faster. It's like an exaggeration, but the idea is the same. Did I answer? No. Okay.
You do realize that a lot of the people going into the House of Representatives have previous other governmental experience that they can easily use, as well as the fact that you don't necessarily want like 70 or 80-year-old people running committees trying to deal with issues that are changing daily?
No, the idea here is that like these people that have been inside of Congress for like 40 or 50 years, despite the fact that they are 78, they had to adapt to the times too in order to get reelected. I'll be hitting that point on the Levin evidence and stuff over here. Okay, on the Levin evidence over here. Okay, we tell you that the causality is wrong. They have it completely backwards. Their only response is that we ignore the 95% rule that they have, that the person that has more money wins 95% of the time. Okay, the reason that is because the people that are more popular amongst the people are the ones that the people give money to. It's reverse causal. They have it backwards, okay? If you think that you should be voting for a candidate, you will give them money, okay? It's not the idea that the money begs votes over here. It's the idea that people that side with the candidate on the issues and on policies are more likely to give them money and support those issues over here. We show you that this is empirically verified in like repeated Senate races back and forth between each other. He like has an empiric on this. Their analysis that it's just 95% doesn't work over here. Okay. Then they say that there's just an incentive. There's like they move it to a middle incentive over here as instead of the long-term incentive that currently exists. We say no, that you move it to a short-term incentive. Here's the thing with this. You're only inside of the House of Representatives for 12 years. What that means is at the end of 12 years, you either need to move up the ladder or you need to find a new job. What that means is that you're less focused on creating policies for longevity because there's only one spot above you, but there are 50 to the side of you. What that means is that you're more likely to go for policies that don't require you to be dealing with them in the future. You absolve yourself of all responsibility at the end of your term. What that means is the longevity that you're looking forward ends very abruptly, much more so than it does right now. That means that you get a lot of the bad impacts that we give on our flow over here, which I'll be getting to also. Okay. Then they say that like this resets districts. Like Republicans in Democratic districts, there are probably very few of these that exist in the United States right now, because if you're a Democrat voting for a Republican, like that doesn't really make sense to you, so you would probably flip your vote. Like there's probably only like 2 of those in the entire United States. They don't give a statistic. So any Democratic advantage like is completely negligible. Then I have the gridlock over here. Like our grandfather argument that we make over here that you get rid of a lot of the people that are running the show right now instead of Congress goes away, that argument still stands over here because that turnover here still stands because you get rid of the people that are like the only ones that are actually trying to keep things moving, that have been here for a while, that are familiar with the judicial, that are familiar with like the legislative processes, and you're replacing them with newbies. On to our case over here. They say that there's no term limits for the executive over here. We say that that's not comparable over here, in these instances. The reason that the term limits exist for the executive is you have one person like basically in charge of an entire branch of government. Here you have 50. It's much easier for executives that are right there to like seize power like dictatorially basically than it is for an executive, a legislator in the legislative branch. That's why term limits exist for executives, like the governor or for the president, or for the president specifically, but not for legislators. It's like you can't compare them over here. Then they say that like it makes them look midterm. We say no. It makes them look short term for the like reasons that we previously said over there. And then over here on institutional memory. This is like kind of an argument that I've been making repeatedly, but I'm like it's formalized now that people that like have been here for a while know how things work, and now they're gone.
A few people.
It only matters if you have a few people and you get rid of all of those people over here.
You only have 30 seconds.
Okay, I know it's good. Then they say that you leave and you like lose your legal immunity, which means you're no longer likely to get you're not gonna get like prosecuted over here. The issue with this is that a lot of the corruption that's taking place is not blatant. Like we can't catch it right now. So even if you lose your legal immunity, it goes like away over here.
Extend impacts.
Hey, they say we don't have impacts. Serial policy failure and like corruption. Those are our two impacts over here.
Global warming, cycle of poverty.
Yeah, and cycle of poverty and global warming are our third one. Alright.
Constitutionality on top. Then a DA. Then half in order. Questions? Cool. Anybody not ready? No. Never. Okay. Anybody not ready? Time starts now. First on constitutionality, we have a factual disagreement here. I encourage you to look it up. If you find that like this court case is actually ruled that this action is unconstitutional, you should probably be giving the round to us. They're basically negated at that point where they're enforcing the status quo. That's an automatic vote for us if you find that. Then, go representative effectiveness. So, a few things here. They basically concede like our entire impact scenario. We say serial policy failure leads to cycle of poverty and leads to preponderance of global warming because corporations are actually able to influence people, or like oil lobbies are actually able to influence congressmen and not pass oil legislation. That's pretty huge impacts. Like you reentrench cycle of poverty in the US, like create a permanent second underclass that will never be able to get out because you have permanent serial policy failure. They can never get them out of this state. That's a huge amount of people. Then, we also do global warming, like perpetuate global warming, makes it so we can never stop it. That affects everybody in the world. Another huge impact, starvation, all that kind of good stuff. So, specifically, they do a lot of attacks on the link levels. So like, first one, institutional memory. They misunderstand institutional memory. The entire idea behind institutional memory is you only need to have a few people in Congress who've actually been there for like 50, 60 years, who understand like who everybody is, who understand all the issues, and like have a firm grasp of what's going on. If you rotate every 12 years, you have none of those people. That's the institutional memory argument. They misinterpret it throughout the entire round. That's a strong link to both of these scenarios. Then they go on. Then they talk about corruption. They say no legal immunity. My partner makes the response that you can't actually catch these people. All this is super down low. You almost never catch like actual lobbyist cases. I actually debated this against Spencer last year, and that was what he ran on me. No kidding. Yeah, it was. Like, don't lie. Okay. Then we can talk about it later. Okay. Okay,
Alright,
so then they also said we don't engage in long-term thinking. They were only responsible to this corporation. I'm going to hit this later. When I hit this later, remember to make the cross-application. Okay? That gives us another internal link to all our impacts. Go into incumbency. So, I specifically extend Levitt. They misunderstand Levitt. Money is the entire internal link to everything in this contention. I read you a specific study. Stephen Levitt, the guy that made Freakonomics, he was an economist in Yale in 1994. He wrote this study. I've done a lot of research on this. He specifically finds that this is reverse causality. Like, we have stats to back this up. We have a study by a really respected economist. You should probably be referring us, or you get a specific warrant on why this is. Like, we can quibble on, whether people get money first and that brings the money, or like people, and then, that they can broadcast and then that brings the popularity. Like, we have national study. We have warrants.
95% is their only response to this. Don't let them make new ones.
Yeah, 95% is their only response to this. Don't let them make new ones. We specifically do a really, really good study on this. It says money doesn't matter. That should be important because that takes out this entire contention. So, specifically, the one important thing you've got to remember is they say corporations are long-term and people will depend on corporations long-term because of money. If money doesn't matter, congressmen will not depend on corporations, right? That's pretty important because that's the response on a lot of our stuff. Remember back on our DA? That's the response on the third link. That falls if money falls. You should probably be buying that argument. Next, go on to the second DA. Specifically, we give you the argument, like, right now populist parties are up, and actually listening to people leads to more populists. Like, they say rotation happens, but you're just electing, like, who the people want. Those people want populists. That turns, like, the argument. So, go on to way. They specifically have, like, local level environmental impacts. Like, that's what they're aiming for right now. Less shutdowns. That's another impact they're aiming for. But it says, like, okay, it decreases poverty in, like, some areas in which this is prevalent, right? In which there, like, isn't already poverty, and, like, Congress people are actually already, reaching out and doing, like, lots of stuff. Like, that doesn't happen for every congressperson, right? Like, they make a lot of arguments that some congressperson, like, 90 and able to do stuff, right? So that means pretty low probability you're actually solving for, like, everything they're talking about. Also, the magnitude is pretty low. Like, we're just engaging in local projects on, like, small local levels that aren't going to be, like, huge in magnitude, changing structural issues. Like, you're shifting things small piece by small piece by small piece. It's a really good, small magnitude impact that they're talking about. Extend the analysis that we specifically make in our impact that basically goes refuted. They say we don't have impacts. I read you impacts. I read you cycle of poverty for everybody in the US because of serial policy failure, right? Like, if we have people that are just looking in the long term or are super corrupt, we're never going to fix issues of poverty, and we're going to only make them worse because we're relying on special interests. I also tell you global warming. That is a huge magnitude impact, right? If you're giving us the link scenarios, which are pretty probable because they don't put a ton of ink on any of these, and we have pretty substantial responses, especially on the third one that says long-term thinking. If you buy money, you buy long-term thinking. That means you get global warming, which is a huge impact. It affects everybody in the world. Magnitude outweighs.
The order is new sheet.
Okay.
The new sheet is an overview. New.
Okay.
I don't know. Read an MO counterpunch. New sheet.
I put overviews of my contestants.
New sheet. Solvency / plan. Advantage 1. Effectiveness disadvantage 2. Uniqueness. We win this debate because we control the uniqueness. They have conceded that what is happening right now is serial policy failure because the people in the House of Representatives right now are universally corrupt. They're universally planning to have careers as lobbyists in the future. They are universally bowing to corporate interests. All those arguments are conceded. They have conceded that what is currently happening in the Congress is serial policy failure, corruption, all the things that they highlight as being problematic. There's a reason that they can cite systematic poverty and global warming impacts, which is that right now the House of Representatives is A, doing nothing about systematic poverty, and B, doing nothing about global warming. This indicates that it is only try or die for the affirmative, because the fact that all the impacts they talk about, all the problems they highlight with the House of Representatives are already occurring means there's only a risk we're able to solve them on the affirmative. Our first voting issue is incumbency. The basic scenario here is absolutely unanswered. You have conceded that people who are incumbents, for whatever reason, are absolutely far more likely to win their races. Even if they win their argument that says, oh, money doesn't matter, you've conceded there are institutional factors, things like the official endorsement and support of the party, which mean that even if money is not the critical factor, these people are still inevitably going to win the races because they're incumbents. You have conceded that people who are doing that, you have conceded that as a result, people develop these kinds of relationships with lobbyists, with corporations, because they think that that is going to secure their political future. You have conceded that as a a result, these people tend to ignore the direct issues that affect their constituents. Things like, oh, they're building a toxic waste dump, or a nuclear plant 3 blocks away. Maybe we should do something about that. Well, never mind. I have my career to consider. That is the kind of impact that they fail to deal with. That is the kind of thing that continues to happen. This outweighs the rest of the case on probability because it is the most proximal. We already know that these kinds of environmental abuses, these kinds of ignorance of local issues are currently occurring in the status quo. We don't need to speculate about what potential impact we could have because we know that these issues are currently being ignored. It means there's a 100% probability that we have at least some risk of solving the possibility of things like poverty, things like environmental devastation, which they've conceded cause tens of thousands of deaths due to things like cancer. Second is gridlock. You have conceded that this controls the link to serial policy failure. If Democrats cannot work with Republicans, that means that policy is inevitably going to fail. So when they tell you that the only impact of this round is serial policy failure on the negative side, that makes it really easy to vote affirmative because the most likely way that serial policy failure will happen is in a world where we are constantly unable to work across party lines. You have conceded that creating incentives for people to plan for 20-year-long careers creates incentives for them to plan focused more on what party leadership wants and less on what their constituents want, and that party leadership is causing the kind of radicalization that makes it impossible to reach across the aisle. Solvency? Look, we're in agreement here. You can go ahead and look it up. It's a 1995 Supreme Court case. Despite what they tell you, this Supreme Court case is very clear about only saying that the state cannot cannot set term limits. However, you'll find that the U.S. federal government absolutely has the right to do so. But even if you don't buy that, you should go for the argument that the United States federal government has the right to make a constitutional amendment about this. You have to assume the plan passes in Parliament. You say people are going to leave. You say people are going to leave, but you've given absolutely no warrant for any of the arguments about institutional memory or why this is important. I don't know what this means. It's just like maybe you know like what the parliamentary procedures are, maybe you know how long the speech times are supposed to be. I don't understand why that is the internal link to effectiveness in Congress, and neither do they. On advantage one about incumbency. They make a couple responses here. First, they say that they have a study that says that more popularity means more funding, but you have conceded my partner's warranted argument, which says the reason people have more funding is because the reason people are more popular is because they have more funding. The fact that they cite a study doesn't mean they win because they have no explanation of what the warrant behind that study is. It's not enough to name a Yale professor. You have to actually explain what the warrant behind that is, which is what they failed to do. It means the scenario goes through uncontested. You say that people are going to make irresponsible short-term policies, but you have conceded that that long-term policymaking means policymaking oriented towards the interest of corporations and of the people who are going to be there in 20 years to fund your 31st re-election campaign. And to the extent that people are focusing on long-term policy, they're focusing on their own long-term self-interest, and you've conceded that is bad. You say very few Republicans are in Democratic districts. That's just not true. You can extend all the impacts here on the environment and on local responsiveness. These arguments go ultimately conceded. They're the most probable they win us around. Let me effectiveness to say. Look, the scenario just doesn't link. There's no explanation of why the reason we have systematic poverty right now is because we don't have enough 50 or 60-term representatives. That ultimately means that the fact that systematic poverty and global warming are occurring in the status quo means you should believe that the reason it's occurring is not just because the representatives are forced out, because it's already occurring right now and we don't have term limits. Yes?
So I bring up the impacts in my speech. The response about the non-unique should be in Lilly's speech.
The non-unique,
we should have a chance to respond to it.
The non-unique was in the PMC. It was the uniqueness to our advantages.
Under consideration.
I also said non-unique.
Yeah. Furthermore, you've conceded that 12 years is longer than the average term length in Congress, which ultimately means that it's probably long enough to establish whatever kind of institutional memory you need. You say that corruption is occurring in subtle ways, but it is currently occurring right now, which probably means that setting term limits isn't going to make it any worse and only has a risk of resolving that. You say that your impacts are warming in the cycle of poverty. There's absolutely no link there. This debate is really straightforward. They've conceded that the corruption and serial policy failure is happening now. The only question is, can we resolve that by creating incentives for people to think about the short-term interests of their constituents and not the long-term interests of corporations. This means there's only a risk that we solve the impacts of both the alpha and the neg. You should affirm.